The modern seeker stands at a crossroads that has existed since humanity first gazed upward and inward, seeking meaning beyond the material veil. This crossroads presents itself today with particular urgency. The choice between high magic, the disciplined, rigorous path of transformation through structured esoteric study, and pop magic, the commodified spirituality of instant gratification and superficial technique. This is not merely a question of methodology, but a fundamental philosophical problem that determines whether one embarks on authentic self-transformation or merely decorates the ego with mystical ornaments. The distinction between these paths traces its lineage through centuries of Western esoteric thought. Hermes Trismegistus, that mythical architect of the Hermetic tradition, established in the Corpus Hermeticum that true Gnosis requires disciplined contemplation and the alignment of the microcosm with the macrocosm. This was not knowledge to be consumed, but wisdom to be embodied through rigorous practice. Paracelsus understood that the physician must first heal himself before attempting to heal others, a recognition that transformation is an inside-out process requiring years of dedicated work. Eliphas Levi, in his systematic reconstruction of Western magic, emphasized that ceremonial practice without philosophical foundation produces nothing but theatrical delusion. Manly Palmer Hall dedicated his encyclopedic mind to documenting the arduous requirements of genuine initiation across traditions, demonstrating that every authentic path demands discipline, study, and systematic inner work. Carl Jung brought this ancient wisdom into modern psychological language, recognizing that what the alchemists called transmutation was fundamentally a process of psychic integration. The great work was not the literal transformation of lead into gold, but the transformation of the unconscious, fragmented psyche into a unified conscious self. This reframing did not diminish the esoteric tradition. Rather, it revealed its perennial relevance. The symbols, rituals, and doctrines of high magic are technologies of consciousness, structured methods for confronting and integrating the hidden aspects of the self. The premise of the Hermetic school rests on this foundation. The true secret is not hidden in dusty grimoires or exclusive lodges, but in the arduous psychological and spiritual work that only the individual can perform. No amount of sigil crafting, crystal arrangements, or social media manifestation techniques can substitute for the systematic confrontation with one's shadow, the disciplined cultivation of will, and the philosophical maturation that authentic esotericism demands. The path of high magic is not easier or more glamorous than its popularized counterpart. It is harder, longer, and lonelier, but it is real. At the heart of high magic lies a systematic architecture of transformation, most clearly articulated in the Seven Hermetic Principles, as expounded in the Kybalion and elaborated across centuries of Western esoteric thought. These principles are not mere abstractions, but operational frameworks through which the practitioner reconstructs consciousness itself. The principle of mentalism declares that the all is mind, the universe is mental. This is not idealism in the philosophical sense, but a recognition that consciousness is primary and that material reality is responsive to focused mental discipline. The magician does not manipulate external forces through superstition, but recognizes that changing internal states produces corresponding changes in perception, behavior, and ultimately, circumstances. This principle connects directly to the Neoplatonic concept of the one emanating through progressively denser levels of reality, nous, psyche, and finally matter. The practitioner of high magic understands that working at the mental level produces more fundamental change than manipulating the material level alone. The principle of correspondence, as above, so below, as below, so above, establishes the fractal nature of reality and justifies the practice of symbolic magic. The microcosm mirrors the macrocosm. The inner world reflects and influences the outer. This principle undergirds the entire Kabbalistic system, where the tree of life maps both the structure of the cosmos and the architecture of the human psyche. Each sephira represents both a cosmic force and a psychological function. To work with these symbols is to work simultaneously on multiple levels of being. The principle of vibration teaches that nothing rests. Everything moves and vibrates at its particular frequency. This connects to the Rosicrucian understanding of degrees of manifestation and the practice of rising on the planes through meditation and ritual. The magician learns to attune consciousness to different frequencies of reality, accessing subtler dimensions through disciplined alteration of mental state. This is not escapism but expansion, a systematic training of attention and awareness. The principle of polarity reveals that apparent opposites are actually degrees of the same thing. Love and hate, hot and cold, light and dark, exist on continua rather than as absolute categories. The alchemical operation of solva et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, works precisely through this principle. The practitioner learns to dissolve rigid mental categories, experience the fluid nature of psychological states, and then reconstitute a more integrated understanding. This connects to Jung's concept of enantiodromia, where any extreme position eventually transforms into its opposite. The mature magician works within this dynamic tension rather than clinging to one pole. The principle of rhythm teaches that everything flows in and out, rises and falls, like a pendulum. This principle demands that the practitioner develop equanimity and long-term perspective. Spiritual progress is not linear. Periods of insight alternate with periods of apparent stagnation or regression. The disciplined practitioner learns to maintain effort during both ascending and descending phases, understanding that both are necessary for growth. The principle of cause and effect states that nothing happens by chance. Every effect has its cause, and every cause produces effects. This is the death of superstition and the birth of magical science. The magician does not petition external entities for favors, but learns to become a conscious cause rather than an unconscious effect. This requires taking radical responsibility for one's mental states, emotional reactions, and behavioral patterns, recognizing that these are not random, but products of prior conditions that can be understood and modified. Finally, the principle of gender recognizes that masculine and feminine principles operate on all planes. This is not about biological sex, but about the dynamics of activity and receptivity, projection and gestation, analysis and synthesis. The magician learns to balance these within the self, integrating the anima and animus in Jungian terms. True magical power emerges not from dominating one principle over the other, but from their harmonious integration. These principles interconnect with the Kabbalistic tree of life, which maps 10 Sephiroth emanations, connected by 22 paths corresponding to the Hebrew letters and tarot trump cards. Each Sephira represents both a cosmic principle and a psychological function. Kether is pure consciousness, Chokmah is dynamic force, Binah is form and structure, and so on down through the tree until reaching Malkuth, the material world. The practitioner's work is to systematically explore and integrate each Sephira, balancing the three pillars of severity, mercy, and equilibrium. This work demands a particular mentality from the aspirant. First, the cultivation of will, not mere desire or whim, but the sustained, focused intention that Aleister Crowley called true will. This is the discovered purpose that aligns individual action with cosmic pattern. Second, the development of rigorous ethics. As the magician gains power to influence consciousness and circumstance, the temptation to use this power for petty egoic ends becomes acute. The genuine tradition emphasizes that power without wisdom produces catastrophe. Third, the willingness to doubt, not cynical dismissiveness, but the philosophical skepticism that tests every claim against experience and reason. The magician must be simultaneously open to mystery and intolerant of self-deception. The transformative process of high magic is best understood through the alchemical sequence of Nigredo, Albedo, and Rubedo, the blackening, whitening, and reddening that constitute the great work. These are not metaphors for chemical processes, but precise descriptions of psychological operations that every serious practitioner must undergo. The journey begins with Nigredo, the blackening, what Jung called the encounter with the shadow. This is the stage of confrontation with everything the conscious mind has repressed, denied, or projected onto others. It is called blackening because the practitioner must descend into the darkest regions of the psyche, acknowledging the selfishness, cruelty, lust, rage, and fear that civilized consciousness prefers to ignore. In practical terms, Nigredo manifests as the systematic breakdown of cherished identifications and ego structures. The practitioner begins to see that the personality they have constructed is largely reactive, a defense mechanism against early wounds, a performance for social approval, a collection of unexamined beliefs inherited from family and culture. This recognition is devastating because it strips away the sense of being a unified, autonomous self. The shadow contains not only negative traits, but also positive qualities that were suppressed because they threatened parental approval or social acceptance. The naturally assertive child, who learned to be perpetually accommodating, the intellectually gifted student who dumbed themselves down to fit in, the creative soul who pursued a practical career, all have shadow material that contains vitality and potential. The alchemical operation here is calcination, burning away the false self through rigorous self-examination. This might take the form of depth psychological work, intensive meditation practice, or ritual operations designed to invoke and confront shadow aspects. The magician might work with deities like Hecate or Saturn, archetypal figures associated with the underworld and limitation. The experience is one of psychological death. The comfortable fiction of who one thought oneself to be cannot survive intact. Jung emphasized that shadow work is not optional for individuation. It is the foundation. Without integrating the shadow, all subsequent spiritual development is compromised. The repressed material will leak out as projection, causing the practitioner to see their own darkness in others and engage in unconscious manipulation while believing themselves enlightened. The spiritual bypasser who speaks of love and light while harboring unacknowledged rage is the cautionary example of incomplete Nigredo. This stage connects to the mystical concept of the dark night of the soul, as described by St. John of the Cross. Although arising from a Christian contemplative context, the phenomenology is identical: the stripping away of consolations, the sense of abandonment by the divine, the crushing recognition of one's own inadequacy and impurity. This is not depression as pathology, but depression as initiation, a necessary passage through dissolution toward eventual reconstitution. Following the descent into Nigredo comes Albedo, the whitening. This is the stage of purification, separation, and initial integration. Having confronted the shadow, the practitioner now begins the work of discrimination, separating what is essential from what is acquired, what is authentic from what is performed. The alchemical operation is separation, distinguishing the subtle from the gross, the volatile from the fixed. In psychological terms, this means developing the capacity to observe mental processes without total identification. The practitioner cultivates the observing ego that Jung described, a center of awareness that can watch thoughts, emotions, and impulses arise without immediately acting on them or believing them to be the totality of self. This is the stage where meditation practice becomes crucial. Through sustained attention training, the practitioner begins to recognize that consciousness is not identical with its contents. Thoughts arise and pass, emotions surge and subside, sensations appear and dissolve. The sense of being a fixed, solid self begins to loosen. This can be terrifying, a form of ego death, but it is also liberating. If the self is not fixed, it can be remade. In the Western esoteric tradition, albedo corresponds to the lunar phase of the work. The moon reflects light but generates none. Similarly, the purified consciousness at this stage reflects divine light without distortion, but has not yet become an independent source of illumination. The practitioner works with lunar deities, Diana, Selene, or the Kabbalistic Yesod, cultivating receptivity, intuition, and the ability to perceive subtle patterns. This is also the stage of working with the anima or animus, the contrasexual aspect of the psyche that Jung identified as the gateway to the unconscious. The male practitioner confronts and integrates his anima, learning to access receptivity, emotionality, and relational intelligence. The female practitioner confronts and integrates her animus, accessing assertiveness, analytical thinking, and individual will. This is not about stereotypical gender traits, but about psychological wholeness, integrating all aspects of being human rather than limiting oneself to culturally prescribed roles. The purification of albedo also involves what the Sufis call polishing the mirror of the heart. Through ethical cultivation, the practitioner aligns behavior with insight. It is not enough to understand shadow dynamics intellectually. One must act differently. This might involve making amends for past harms, establishing boundaries where before there were none, or developing virtues like patience, generosity, and courage that were previously weak. The danger at this stage is spiritual pride. Having done significant inner work, The practitioner may believe themselves enlightened or superior to those still identified with ego. This is a trap. Albedo is a stage, not the destination. The purified ego is still an ego. It has simply become more refined and less reactive. The work is far from complete. Rubedo, the reddening, is the final stage of the alchemical work, the creation of the philosopher's stone, the achievement of the conjunction, the birth of the self in Jungian terms. This is the integration of all previous work into a unified, conscious, and vital mode of being. The alchemical operation is conjunction, the sacred marriage of opposites. What was separated in Albedo is now reunited at a higher level. Consciousness and unconscious, masculine and feminine, spirit and matter, individual and universal. These polarities are held in dynamic tension without collapsing into undifferentiated fusion or fragmenting into dissociated parts. In psychological terms, Rubedo represents the achievement of individuation, the process by which one becomes fully oneself. This is not the inflation of ego, but its relativization. The individuated person recognizes the ego as one voice among many in the psyche, a necessary executive function, but not the totality of being. The self, Jung's term for the totality of conscious and unconscious, the archetype of wholeness, becomes the new center of gravity. This stage is marked by the integration of the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to hold paradox and ambiguity without premature resolution. The individuated person can contain contradiction, being simultaneously humble and confident, detached and engaged, individual and connected to the whole. This is the fulfillment of the Hermetic maxim, solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. All fixed positions have been dissolved in Nigredo, purified in Albedo, and now reconstituted in Rubedo as a fluid, responsive, conscious way of being. Rubedo is associated with solar consciousness, the capacity to generate rather than merely reflect light. The solar practitioner becomes a source of insight and vitality for others, not through grandiosity, but through authentic embodiment of integrated being. This connects to the Kabbalistic path of Tifereth, the sphere of the sun on the tree of life, which represents beauty, harmony, and the balanced center where all polarities meet. The experience of Rubedo is often described in mystical literature as the mystic marriage or hieros gamos, the sacred union that produces the divine child, symbolizing the birth of a new mode of consciousness. This is not a static achievement, but a dynamic equilibrium that must be maintained through ongoing practice. The individuated person does not retire from the work. Rather, they continue to deepen and refine their relationship with the self. This stage also brings what Jung called symbolic life, the capacity to live consciously within the framework of meaningful symbols that connect personal experience to transpersonal patterns. The practitioner no longer experiences life as a series of random events, but as a meaningful unfolding with mythic dimensions. This does not mean imposing a narrative on reality, but perceiving the narrative that is already present. No honest account of the esoteric path can omit the inevitable crisis that occurs at the deepest point of Nigredo, what spiritual traditions have called the dark night of the soul, and what depth psychology recognizes as necessary ego death. This is not a side effect or complication of the work. It is the work itself at its most intense. The crisis typically arrives after the initial enthusiasm of beginning the path has faded. The seeker has done enough work to dismantle old certainties, but not yet enough to establish new ground. Identity feels unstable. The beliefs and values that previously provided meaning now seem hollow or arbitrary. The personality structures that once felt like solid self are revealed as defense mechanisms and social performances. The resulting vertigo is profound. This is the stage alchemists called mortificatio, death. It is experienced as psychological death because the ego genuinely believes it is dying. In a sense, it is. The ego as primary center of identity must die for the self to emerge. But the ego does not surrender its throne willingly. It fights, bargains, despairs, and finally, if the work continues, surrenders. The phenomenology of this crisis includes profound doubt about the value and reality of the spiritual path, feelings of being abandoned by whatever one previously called divine, acute awareness of one's own hypocrisy, weakness and failure, the sense that one has wasted years on delusion, overwhelming fatigue and inability to continue practices that once provided solace, existential loneliness, even when surrounded by others, and the temptation to abandon the path entirely, either through regressing to conventional consciousness or through premature transcendence into dissociated spiritual states. This crisis must be distinguished from clinical depression, though the two can coexist. Clinical depression is often characterized by meaninglessness, flatness of affect, anhedonia, and suicidal ideation arising from neurochemical dysfunction, trauma, or both. It requires medical and therapeutic intervention. The dark night, by contrast, is teleological. It has a purpose and direction within the framework of psychological development. It is not meaningless suffering, but meaningful suffering, the pain that precedes rebirth. The crucial difference is that the dark night retains a connection to meaning, even while experiencing profound suffering. The practitioner suffers precisely because they care deeply about truth, integrity, and authentic transformation. The suffering arises from the gap between the ideal and the actual, between who one hoped to become and who one actually is. This is productive suffering. It drives transformation, whereas pathological depression tends towards stasis and entropy. That said, the distinction is not always clear, and practitioners experiencing severe symptoms should not hesitate to seek professional help. The romantic notion of suffering for one's art, or no pain, no gain spirituality, can be a dangerous rationalization for ignoring genuine mental health crises. The wise practitioner knows when to seek support. The existential despair of the dark night also differs from nihilism. The nihilist concludes that because no transcendent meaning can be objectively proven, existence is meaningless. The practitioner in the dark night has not abandoned meaning, but has had all false meanings stripped away. This creates a vacuum that is excruciating, but also fertile. Into this void, authentic meaning can emerge, not inherited or imposed, but discovered through the ordeal itself. Many traditions recognize this stage as necessary and even honored. In the Eleusinian mysteries, initiates descended into a dark underground chamber where they confronted death imagery before emerging to witness the sacred revelation. In Tibetan Buddhism, code practice involves ritually offering one's body to demons, a symbolic enactment of ego death. In Christian mysticism, the via negativa strips away all concepts and images of God until only unknowing remains. These are not masochistic practices, but sophisticated psychological technologies for facilitating ego transcendence. The magician must understand that this crisis, while agonizing, is evidence that the work is proceeding correctly. If there is no crisis, there has been no genuine transformation, only intellectual understanding or superficial ritual that leaves the core ego intact. The pop magic approach avoids this stage entirely by never asking the practitioner to confront anything genuinely threatening to ego identity. It is painless because it is also pointless. The only way through the dark night is through. Attempting to bypass it through spiritual techniques, substance use, or immersion in distractions only prolongs the agony. The practitioner must sit with the despair, allowing it to dissolve what must be dissolved. This requires immense courage and, ideally, the support of a teacher or guide who has traversed this terrain and can confirm that emergence is possible. Eventually, if the practitioner maintains the work, something shifts. The despair does not gradually lessen. Rather, there is a qualitative transformation in the relationship to suffering. What Jung called the transcendent function emerges, the capacity to hold opposing tensions without collapsing. The practitioner discovers a center of awareness that is not destroyed by the death of the ego, because it was never identical with the ego. This is the birth of the self, and with it comes Rubedo, the final stage of integration. The goal of high magic is not the acquisition of supernatural powers, the accumulation of esoteric knowledge, or entrance into exclusive fraternities. These may occur as secondary effects, but they are not the target. The goal is the philosopher's stone, the achievement of an integrated, conscious, ethically mature self, capable of navigating reality with clarity, vitality, and wisdom. In psychological terms, this is Jung's self. In alchemical language, it is the rebes, the divine androgyne. In mystical vocabulary, it is gnosis, direct knowledge of one's true nature. This integrated state is not a permanent high or a static arrival, but a new baseline of functioning. The individuated person has not transcended the human condition but has fully entered it. They experience the full range of human emotion, joy and sorrow, love and anger, hope and grief. but without being tyrannized by these states. Emotions arise and are felt fully, but they do not dictate behavior unconsciously. There is space between stimulus and response, and in that space, choice. The integrated self possesses what the Stoics called apatheia, not apathy in the modern sense of indifference, but a calm passion, an engagement with life that is not destabilized by external circumstances. This is the fruit of having confronted and integrated the shadow, purified the consciousness, and achieved the sacred marriage of opposites. The practitioner has done the work of separating essential self from acquired identity, and then reconstituted a personality that is authentic rather than reactive. This state brings with it a profound ethical responsibility. The magician who has achieved any degree of integration possesses genuine power, not the theatrical power to make candles flicker or coins appear, but the power to influence consciousness, both their own and others. This power can be used destructively or constructively, for ego inflation or service to something greater. The tradition emphasizes that power without wisdom is catastrophic. The ethical framework of high magic is not based on conventional morality, but on alignment with reality. The integrated practitioner acts rightly not out of fear of punishment or desire for reward, but because they perceive clearly the interconnection of all things. To harm another is to harm the whole, which includes oneself. To act with wisdom and compassion is to strengthen the pattern that sustains all being. This is not altruism as self-sacrifice, but enlightened self-interest, recognizing that the boundary between self and other is more permeable than unexamined consciousness assumes. In practical terms, the integrated practitioner brings several capacities into the world. First, the capacity for presence, being fully attentive to the reality of the moment rather than lost in rehearsing the past or anticipating the future. Second, the capacity for creative response, meeting each situation freshly rather than reacting from conditioned patterns. Third, the capacity for generative work, contributing to culture, community, or consciousness in ways that outlast the individual life. The practitioner also develops what Maslow called being cognition, perception that is not distorted by personal needs, fears, or projections. This does not mean perfect objectivity, which is impossible for an embodied being, but a clarity that recognizes and compensates for subjective bias. The integrated person sees others more accurately because they are not compulsively projecting their own shadow material onto everyone they meet. This clarity extends to self-perception as well. The individuated person knows themselves, not with narcissistic obsession, but with honest assessment. They recognize their capacities and limitations, their gifts and weaknesses. This self-knowledge allows them to contribute what they actually can, rather than performing an inflated or deflated version of themselves. The path of high magic, as taught and practiced within the Hermetic school, demands this level of rigor precisely because anything less produces self-deception dressed in mystical language. The discipline of systematic study grounds the practitioner in the accumulated wisdom of centuries of practitioners who walked this path before. The rigor of structured practice, ritual, meditation, contemplation, ethical cultivation, ensures that insights are embodied rather than remaining merely intellectual. The requirement of psychological honesty guards against the primary danger of all spiritual paths, the inflation of ego disguised as spiritual attainment. The modern world offers countless paths of instant gratification, superficial technique, and consumerist spirituality. Pop magic promises results without effort, power without responsibility, transformation without crisis. It is fundamentally a lie that flatters the ego and leaves the psyche untransformed. The seeker who wants genuine transformation must be willing to pay the price: years of study, painful self-confrontation, existential crisis, and the surrender of cherished illusions. But the reward is real. The integrated self is not a theoretical construct, but an achievable state of consciousness that brings clarity, vitality, ethical power, and genuine connection to the depths of being. This is not salvation in the religious sense. The practitioner remains fully human, subject to aging, illness, and death, but they face these universal conditions with dignity, courage, and often with a sense of meaning that transforms suffering from meaningless pain into purposeful ordeal. The Hermetic school exists to support this arduous journey, providing the maps, tools, and community that make the impossible merely difficult. It does not promise easy victories or quick fixes. It promises only that those who commit to the work with sincerity, discipline, and philosophical rigor will discover capacities they did not know they possessed and become versions of themselves they could not previously imagine. The gold you seek is not hidden in distant temples or secret lodges, not locked in ancient grimoires or guarded by exclusive orders. The gold you seek is not in the crucible at all. It is in the will that kindles the flame, in the consciousness that endures the heat, and in the patience that awaits the transformation. The great work is not performed on base metals, but on the base self, and the alchemist, the crucible, and the fire are one.